I will never forget the night my own daughter looked me in the eye and told me not to come to her shower because my presence would ruin everything. She said I carried heavy energy, that people would notice it, and that it was better if I stayed home. I had spent weeks preparing, paying deposits, arranging food, and choosing decorations. And yet, in one cold breath, she cut me out as if I were nothing. My heart sank, my hands trembled, and in that moment, I understood how deep betrayal could slice. I did not argue, I did not plead, I simply stayed quiet, but silence has a way of carrying its own power, and by the next day it was no longer me who sat in shame, it was her. Thank you for watching and for giving me a few minutes of your time. It means more to me than I can ever truly say. And before I go on, I would love to know where you are watching from, so please leave me a comment and share it with me. Because hearing from you makes me feel less alone in this journey. Now, after my daughter told me those words, I sat quietly in my chair and stared at the wall, trying to understand how the same girl I had carried through every storm of life could look at me and see nothing but a shadow. I remembered the nights I worked 2 shifts so she could have shoes that were not worn through at the toes. I remembered the mornings I walked in the cold with empty pockets so she could sit in a warm classroom with a full lunch bag, and as I sat there, the weight of those memories pressed on me, making the silence in the room louder than any argument I could have spoken. I did not reach for the phone. I did not beg her to change her mind. Instead, I let her words sit between us like a wall. And though they pierced me, I knew deep inside that a wall built on cruelty cannot stand forever. My name is Margaret, and I am 68 years old, a woman who has lived through years of storms and still found reasons to smile. Yet nothing could have prepared me for the moment when the very child I sacrificed everything for told me that I was no longer welcome at her side. I raised her alone after her father passed away. I carried the weight of both mother and father on my shoulders. I stood in long lines at the factory when my back ached, and I scrubbed other people's floors late into the night so that she would never feel the sting of hunger I once knew. I stitched her clothes when money was thin. I sold my wedding ring when tuition was due. I gave her every ounce of strength I had without ever asking for repayment, because I believed that love was enough to carry us both through the hardest winters. As she grew older, I saw her change. Her smile became sharper, her words quicker, and her eyes seemed to look past me more often than they looked at me. But I told myself, it was just the impatience of youth, the rush of wanting more out of life. I never blamed her for dreaming of better things, because I had always dreamed of those same things for her. Yet somewhere along the way, my giving turned into her taking, and my sacrifices became things she no longer remembered. When she called me and told me to stay away, it was not just a rejection of my presence at one celebration. It was as if she was rejecting the very foundation of her own story, the roots that had held her steady. That night, while the house was quiet and the clock ticked like a reminder that time spares no one, I sat alone with my thoughts, and they came heavy, one after the other, like waves crashing on a fragile shore. I thought of the nights I had carried her fevered body in my arms to the hospital, whispering prayers under my breath that she would survive. I thought of the afternoons I skipped meals so she could have an extra portion on her plate. I thought of the countless times I told her that she could be anything in this world if she only worked hard enough. And now here I was, excluded from a moment I had helped build with my own hands. It felt like being erased, like being told that the chapters I had written no longer belonged in the book of her life. But even in that pain, I did not scream. I did not raise my voice to the night sky and ask why. I simply sat with the silence and let it wash over me, because deep down I knew something she had yet to learn, that life has a way of correcting what is broken, that cruelty has a way of turning back on itself. I sipped my tea slowly, tasting the bitterness as if it were the echo of her words, and I told myself that, though she had chosen to cast me aside, my story was not ending in shame. It was only beginning to show her what dignity looks like when it refuses to bow to ungratefulness. The days leading up to the celebration were supposed to be filled with joy, yet for me they became days of quiet sorrow, because every detail of that gathering had passed through my hands. From the first conversation about decorations to the last payment I made for the hall. I remember walking through the shop aisles, carefully picking out flowers that would brighten the tables, running my fingers across fabric swatches until I found colors that I thought would make her smile, and writing checks with a trembling hand while whispering to myself that it was worth every penny if it brought her happiness. I spoke with the caterer, tasting dishes, adjusting menus, and even changing orders when I thought the food might not be enough. Because in my heart, I wanted her day to be perfect, to be the kind of day she could remember with pride. Yet in the end, I was told that my presence was not worthy of standing among the guests. When I heard her words echoing in my head, calling me heavy, as if my spirit carried a weight that would spoil the air, I felt a kind of pain that no doctor could ever treat. It was not just about being excluded. It was about being dismissed by the very one I had lifted up my entire life. And in that dismissal, every sacrifice I had ever made seemed invisible. Every late night at work, every ache in my bones, every tear I had swallowed in silence. I tried to make sense of it, telling myself that perhaps she was under pressure, that perhaps her mind was clouded with nerves. But then I remembered the tone of her voice, sharp, dismissive, almost rehearsed. And I knew that this was not a slip of the tongue, it was a choice. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, staring at the receipts neatly folded in an envelope, the ones that showed the total cost of her celebration. And I thought about how strange it was that numbers on paper could speak louder than the years of devotion written in my heart. I had given without hesitation, not because I wanted thanks, but because I wanted her to feel secure, to know she was not alone. Yet her words made me realize that somewhere along the way she had mistaken generosity for obligation, love for duty, respect for something optional. I poured myself another cup of tea, watching the steam curl upward, and I thought about how fragile respect really is, how it can take decades to build and only seconds to destroy. That night, the house felt colder than usual, and as I pulled the blanket over my shoulders, I whispered to myself that sometimes silence is the only weapon left when words are turned into knives. I did not call her back. I did not argue with her decision. I simply let the stillness settle over me. Because deep inside I understood that lessons are not taught by shouting or pleading. They are taught by the quiet firmness of consequences. I closed my eyes and pictured her walking through that decorated hall surrounded by laughter, convinced she had silenced me. And though it stung to imagine my absence, a stronger thought came to me, that the very things she took for granted were tied not to her will but to mine. And one day soon, she would learn that love cannot be trampled without cost. The morning of the celebration came, and while others were dressing in their finest clothes and gathering with smiles, I sat alone in my chair with the curtains half drawn, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and birdsong that carried no joy to my ears. On the table beside me lay the gift I had carefully chosen, wrapped in soft paper and tied with ribbon, waiting to be given but never to be received. My heart ached as I imagined the room I had paid for filled with chatter and laughter, plates clinking, music playing, people raising glasses in cheer, and in the middle of it all my daughter smiling as if she had built that moment all on her own. I pictured her standing proudly while I sat miles away, erased, unseen, and it felt as though she had taken a knife to the bond between us and cut it clean through. I poured myself a cup of tea and tried to steady my hands, but the more I thought about it, the heavier the air felt in the room. Every tick of the clock reminded me of another moment passing, another smile I had bought with my own sacrifice that I would never witness. I thought of how I had once dreamed of being part of her milestones, standing beside her in photographs, telling her child one day about the strength it took to raise her. But now I saw clearly that she wanted me erased from the story altogether. My chest tightened with the weight of that realization, but I held my head high, even in the silence, because I knew that dignity is not measured by where you are seen, but by how you carry yourself when you are cast aside. The hours dragged on slowly, and though I was tempted to let bitterness swallow me, I chose instead to sit in quiet reflection, reminding myself that storms pass and truth always rises. I told myself that no matter how loud her laughter might echo that day, it could not drown out the truth of who built the foundation beneath her feet. She may have thought she had silenced me, but deep inside I knew she was only silencing herself from the kind of love and respect that money cannot buy. And while she danced and posed for pictures, I sat with my tea cooling beside me, knowing that the real celebration would not be in her hall, but in the lessons that would find her sooner than she expected. When the evening finally settled in and the lights from her celebration had dimmed somewhere far from me, I remained in my chair with the ribboned gift still resting untouched at my side. And in the stillness of that moment, I thought about the path that had brought me here. I remembered the girl I once carried on my hip, the little hands that clung to me when thunder shook the house, the bright eyes that once looked at me with trust and warmth, and it broke something inside me to know that those same eyes now saw me as nothing more than an unwelcome shadow. The ache was not only from her words, it was from the way they stripped me of every memory of sacrifice, as though the countless hours I had given, the sleepless nights, the long years of working and saving, had been swept aside with one cruel sentence. I sat there replaying her voice in my head. The coldness of it, the way she said I brought heavy energy, as if the weight of my years, the lines on my face, and the stories written in my soul were shameful burdens, rather than the very strength that had carried her into the life she now enjoyed. My mind wandered to all the moments she never saw. The nights I stitched her clothes by candlelight so she would never stand out in class. The times I stood in line for hours to buy her something special, even when my own shoes were falling apart. The afternoons I bent my back in other people's homes so she could walk with her head high in her own. Each of those memories felt like bricks I had laid carefully one by one, building her future with my bare hands. And yet she had turned around and told me that I was unworthy of standing inside the very house I built. The silence in my home grew heavier, and though the hurt sat deep in my chest, I knew I could not allow despair to be my only companion. I poured another cup of tea, my fingers curling around the warmth of the cup, and I told myself that love without respect is no love at all, and sacrifice without gratitude becomes invisible to those who only take. As I sat there, a calm came over me, not the calm of acceptance, but the calm of knowing that life always has a way of balancing what has been tipped too far. I thought about the trust I had arranged, the accounts I had opened, the clauses written so carefully by the lawyer who had warned me years ago that sometimes even family could turn selfish. And in that moment I realized that though she had tried to erase me, she had already bound herself to me in ways she could not control. I leaned back and let out a long breath, feeling the sting of betrayal soften into a quiet strength, because I knew that while she spent her evening basking in the false glow of celebration, a different kind of truth was already making its way toward her doorstep. I did not need to raise my voice or make a scene. I did not need to show up uninvited to prove that I belonged, for dignity has its own way of speaking. And tomorrow it would arrive in the form of a letter that would remind her who had carried the true weight all along. The next morning came quietly, the sun barely lifting above the horizon, and while I sat with my tea cooling beside me, a courier was already making his way across town with an envelope in his hands, an envelope that carried more weight than all the laughter and music of the night before. I imagined her opening the door with the same pride she wore at her celebration, expecting perhaps another gift or a card of congratulations, only to find herself holding papers she never thought existed. Inside those folded sheets lay the truth, written in black and white, that the funds she had been using so freely, the ones she believed were hers without question, were not hers at all, but tied to conditions she had never respected. I pictured her face as she read the words, the shock running through her as she realized the accounts had been frozen, the trust amended, the promises she had taken for granted now beyond her reach. All her assumptions, all her careless disregard, shattered in the space of a few sentences. And while she might have thought I was powerless, sitting at home in silence, she was learning in that moment that silence can hold more strength than shouting ever could. I knew her hands must have trembled the way mine once did, not with hurt, but with fear. Fear of losing what she had counted on. Fear of having to face the truth that the woman she cast aside still held the strings she thought she had cut. I did not smile when I thought of it, nor did I feel the sweetness of revenge. Instead, I felt the steady calm of justice. The kind that does not roar, but settles deep into the bones like a reminder that respect must be earned, not demanded. She could not erase me, she could not paint me out of her story. For even in her attempt to silence me, it was my name, my work, and my choices that wrote the very lines she was now forced to read. And so I sat there, letting the morning light touch my face, knowing that the letter had spoken louder than I ever could, and that my dignity, though bruised, had found its way back into the center of her life, whether she welcomed it or not. Not long after the letter reached her hands, the silence of my house was broken by the shrill ring of the phone. And though I had expected it, the sound still carried a sting, because I knew on the other end would be the same voice that once told me to stay away, now trembling with desperation. When I answered, I heard the panic dripping from every word, her tone sharp and uneven as she demanded to know what had happened, asking how the money could suddenly be gone, how the accounts she had relied on had turned cold overnight. I listened without interrupting, letting her spill her fear into the receiver, her words tripping over each other, as though if she spoke fast enough, she could undo what had been written. When her voice finally broke and she asked me if I was behind it, I spoke calmly, not with anger, not with pride, but with the steady strength that comes only when you have nothing left to lose. I told her the truth, that respect is not a decoration you put on when it suits you, but the very foundation upon which trust stands, and that without it, the walls come crashing down. I reminded her that she had called me heavy, that she had stripped me of my place in her moment, yet still she had leaned on the very weight of my sacrifices to hold her life steady. I said softly into the phone that heavy energy does not pay for strollers, it does not book halls, it does not feed guests, and it certainly does not write blank checks for those who believe they owe nothing in return. There was silence on the other end, the kind of silence that tells you a person has been forced to face themselves in the mirror for the first time. And in that silence, I felt no victory, only a deep ache that it had come to this, that love had turned into a battlefield where respect was the price of survival. I did not raise my voice. I did not lecture her with long speeches. I simply told her that choices carry weight, and that she had made hers the moment she cast me aside. Then I placed the receiver down gently, not slamming it, not in anger, but in quiet finality, knowing that the lesson had been delivered, not by my lips alone, but by the ink of a letter that she would not be able to forget. After I laid the receiver down, I sat for a long while in the stillness of my kitchen. The steam from my tea long faded into the air, and though my hands no longer trembled, my heart was heavy with thoughts that came one after another. I did not take pleasure in her panic, nor did I smile at her desperation, for there is no joy in watching the one you love stumble into a truth you had prayed they would never force you to reveal. What I felt instead was a sorrow deep and sharp, the sorrow of a mother who had given everything and now found herself forced to teach through consequence rather than guidance, through absence rather than presence. Yet beneath that sorrow, there was also a quiet strength, the knowledge that by standing firm, I was protecting not only myself, but the very meaning of love that had been bruised by her thoughtless cruelty. I rose from my chair and walked through the house, my eyes falling on the walls that held photographs of her childhood, each picture a reminder of the years when her laughter filled these rooms without judgment, when her small arms wrapped around my neck, as though I was her whole world. Each image whispered to me of the sacrifices behind the smiles, the nights of hunger hidden behind a gentle lullaby, the mornings of aching bones hidden beneath a steady hand guiding her out the door to school. I stopped before one picture, where she was barely 5, smiling with crumbs on her cheeks from the cake I had saved coins to buy. And in that moment, I wondered how the little girl in that frame had grown into the woman who believed I was nothing more than a burden to be hidden away. The following days unfolded slowly, each one carrying a silence that seemed heavier than the last. And though the phone rang more than once, I let it sit unanswered. Because I knew the cries on the other end were not born of true remorse, but of panic over what had been lost. I moved through my home with a calm that surprised even me, dusting shelves, tending to the plants on the windowsill, folding laundry with steady hands, all while my mind lingered on the lesson that had been written in that letter. I did not take revenge. I did not seek to punish. I simply allowed her to taste the reality of her choices. For sometimes the hardest truths are not spoken face to face, but delivered in envelopes that cannot be ignored. One afternoon, I stepped into my small garden, the late sun spilling across the soil I had tended for years, and I felt a sense of peace settle in me as I thought about the difference between what is owed and what is earned. My daughter had believed that money would always flow without end, that love meant a constant stream of giving without question. But the moment she cut me out with her cruel words, she severed her own connection to that wellspring. I breathed deeply and told myself that love is strongest when it is built on respect, and without respect, even the most generous gift becomes fragile, destined to shatter in ungrateful hands. As I watered the flowers, I remembered her voice calling me heavy, and though the memory still stung, it no longer broke me, for I had come to see that heaviness is not always a curse. The weight I carried through the years, the burdens of sacrifice, the long nights and weary mornings, had made me strong enough to stand when others might have fallen. That weight was not poison. It was the very foundation that gave her a life she had been too blind to value. And if she could not see that, then it was time for her to learn, not through my words, but through the emptiness left when my giving was withdrawn. In the quiet that followed, I began to see more clearly than I had in years. And though my heart still carried the bruise of her words, I no longer let it weigh me down, because I realized that some wounds are not meant to break you but to open your eyes. I looked around my home, the same rooms where I had once rocked her to sleep, the same walls that had heard both laughter and tears, and I understood that my worth was never tied to her approval. It was written in every act of love I had given, in every sacrifice I had made when no one was watching. The letter had spoken on my behalf, and though it may have shaken her, it steadied me, reminding me that silence can protect what shouting might destroy. I sat at the kitchen table one evening, the fading light painting soft shadows across the floor, and I thought about how life has a way of teaching lessons in places we least expect. For her, it was in the shock of a frozen account, in the realization that love cannot be demanded while respect is denied. For me, it was in the strength of letting go, in allowing dignity to speak louder than desperation. I did not need to be at her side to prove I was part of her story, because my presence was already stitched into every step she had ever taken, and that truth could never be erased, no matter how hard she tried. There were moments when I wished things had been different, when I longed for a softer path where kindness was returned with gratitude, but life had given me this road instead. One where betrayal cut deep, yet also carved space for strength to grow. And as I lifted my cup and took a slow sip, I whispered to myself that peace does not come from being included in every celebration. It comes from knowing who you are when you are left out, from standing tall even when someone tries to push you down. I knew she would carry the weight of her choices, just as I carried the weight of my sacrifices. And in that balance, I found my calm. In the end, I came to understand that her words may have wounded me, but they did not define me. For dignity is not something that can be taken away by rejection. It is something you choose to carry, no matter how others treat you. She had her celebration without me, but I had my peace, and in the quiet of my own home, I found a strength she could not touch. The letter had spoken the truth she refused to hear, that respect is the key that unlocks love's true value, and without it, even the richest gifts turn to dust. I sat with that knowledge and felt no bitterness, only a steady calm, because I knew that in time she would realize the cost of her cruelty, and that lesson would follow her longer than my absence ever could. Thank you for staying with me till the very end of my story. It means more to me than I can ever say. And if this touched your heart, please subscribe so you will not miss the truths I still have to share.